My name is Adan Ortega. I'm principal of Ortega Strategies Group and executive director for the California Association of Mutual Water Companies, and I'd like to welcome you to the American Association of Water Distribution and Management's Thought Leadership Lab video module series. AAWDM is a 501c3 nonprofit that's formed to advance the educational pursuits of public water systems and related entities throughout the United States. In concert with Appalachian State University, California Association of Mutual Water Companies, and our charter lab members, we offer salient and meaningful videos on emerging issues facing the water industry. The video module on workers' compensation is sponsored by Zenith Insurance Company, which is one of the oldest and largest workers' compensation carriers in California. They also serve as the workers' compensation insurance provider for the CalMutual's J. Prima. A sincere thank you to Davidson Pattis, Zenith's Chief Operating Officer, for imparting his knowledge on this important topic. We welcome you to visit AAWDM's website at www.AAWDM.WorkersCompensation for more details on the association's mission, initiatives, and services. AAWDM video modules are available to all public water systems, related entities, and supporting stakeholders. Utilization of any aspect of this video without the express written permission of AAWDM is strictly prohibited. As with any presentation, the opinions associated with this subject matter are those of the speakers and not AAWDM, its members, or supporters. Davidson, thank you for joining us today. Please tell us a little bit about your background before we get started.
Yeah, I'd be happy to, and thanks so much for having me in to talk about this important topic of workers' compensation. My job is Chief Operating Officer at Zenith Insurance Company. As you said earlier, we are one of the larger workers' compensation companies based here in California. We've been in the market for about 60 years. As far as my particular role, I'm in charge of the claims operation, which for us includes a lot of different areas, and I think we'll talk a little bit about why that's important later, but for us claims includes medical as well as legal, as well as the claims adjusters, people who look into fraud, the way we structure our medical networks, and so forth. I also am privileged to be able to serve on the Fairfax Innovation Working Group, which is a cross-company group that looks at issues of innovation around the world, and maybe we'll get into a little bit of that. As far as my time in this field, I've been doing this for about 25 years of management experience as well as legal. I got my Juris Doctor at Georgetown University, and before that I got my Bachelor of Arts at Brown University.
Well, tell us a little bit about what we're going to talk about today and how it's going to help our viewers.
So up here on the slide are some of our key objectives, and the sort of overarching point I want people to appreciate is that workers' compensation is a kind of insurance that you get, and you must get if you have employees. It's legally required. Unfortunately, a lot of times people consider it to be a commodity, meaning that it doesn't really matter where you get it from, and maybe the best approach is to buy the cheapest. And what I want to share with you is some facts and details that can make, whether it be a water district or really anybody who can watch this video, better educated consumers of workers' compensation. There's a point up here on the slide that the comprehensive cost analysis transcends base rates. So what does that really mean? That's a lot of words. But basically it gets down to you get what you pay for sometimes. And we'll talk a bit more about integrated services and how an employer who really cares about their employees can align with an insurance company or somebody who's handling their claims to get the best outcome. And that's what we're all aiming for.
So Davidson, how did this whole concept of workers' compensation start, and how does it work?
So that's a great question. I'm glad you asked that. What's important to understand about the historical perspective of workers' compensation is what was it intended to do at the beginning. And the way things used to work in the world, if you, Adan, were working in a factory, and you were injured, your only way of getting care may be to sue your employer. And we all know lawsuits can take a long time, and how do you eat at the time? How do you get groceries? And what about the fact that you're not able to earn a wage? And so workers' compensation came about in the early 1900s as what they called the grand bargain at the time. And what ended up happening is employers got the protection from lawsuits, but in exchange, the injured person didn't have to bring a lawsuit, didn't have to hire a lawyer necessarily, and they got certain benefits. And those benefits would include things like temporary disability payments, wage replacement. So if you can't go to your job while you're healing from whatever injury you had, you would get your wages paid. Also medical care, and in fact medical care for the rest of your life if it was necessary, if the injury were severe enough. And then finally death benefits, which is a very sad situation, but not everybody has life insurance, and the system realized that you might be your sole breadwinner of the family, and if you're injured on the job, you'd be able to get a benefit that would go to your widow or widower.
The grand bargain sounds like a great idea, and it makes a lot of sense. But how does it work in California these days?
So that's a good question, too. In California, we've gotten a bit far afield from a no-fault system where you get injured on the job and your employer or their insurance company just takes care of you. In California, we have quite high litigation rates, which might sound funny because I told you already that it's supposed to be a no-fault system, and it is, so why would there be litigation? And I think we'll get into a little bit of that. There's also this concept of permanent disability. So let me explain that just for a second. If you get injured on the job, let's say you twist your knee, you might be totally fine. You do a little physical therapy, you get back in shape, but let's suppose it's more severe and you have to have surgery. The law recognizes that you might have some permanent disability, meaning you're never going to be quite as good as you were, and an amount of money comes with that. In California, the amount of permanent disability payments is much, much higher than it is in many other states. Also, we experience high medical costs later in the claim. So again, you think about your twisted knee, what is that going to take? Maybe 2 weeks of rehab and you get back. In California, the average claim when you've lost time and have permanent disability can last 3.5 years, just on average, which seems like a really long time. Also, we have this phenomenon of late reported claims. So a claim where you come to me and you say, I was injured, but it was some time ago, and that's a very prevalent aspect of California workers' compensation, which makes it difficult because memories fade, witnesses are gone, and it might not be as easy for me to figure out what exactly happened and how can I best address it.
So it sounds like the whole concept has gotten away from the original idea. Has there been any legislation to try to fix that?
Well, it's interesting you should ask about legislation. Let me show you a picture of all the legislation. So originally, workers' compensation, very simple. I have books from back in the 1940s which had the entire legislative scheme for workers' compensation, and there may be 20 pages. Here on the screen, I'm showing in 1999, fairly recently, the book on the right-hand side shows you what the entire workers' compensation law looked like, and now the current book is, 2.5 times the size. So it's become very complex. As to your specific question about legislation and reforms, yes, actually, every governor in recent memory has come into office, starting with Arnold Schwarzenegger back in the early 2000s and more recently with Governor Brown, and they've tried to bring the system back to a fair level, but more of the original intent. So some of the reforms that happened, now about 13, 14 years ago, established medical networks. So that was the ability to find doctors who are really good at workers' compensation. If you think about it, if you needed a really good spine surgeon, you would probably go to a spine surgeon. You wouldn't necessarily go to a pulmonologist, somebody who treats your lungs. Same thing with workers' compensation. You want specialists. The reforms established objective basis of determining permanent disability. So that thing we talked about with your knee, now they'll say, well, Don, how far can you bend your knee? Can you lift things? Can you squat? And they'll do an objective measurement to try and get to that number. They also created these things called panel qualified medical evaluators. So expert doctors, if you and I disagree, let's say I'm your employer and you get injured, and I say, no, I'm not really sure that you're as injured as you say, we would go to an expert doctor, and that person would help us understand what that would look like. And overall, that did some positive things. Rates did go down.
So are the reforms still working? Are they still effective?
Well, so let's take a look at where things stand today. Up on the screen again, you can see a chart that shows the progression of the cost of a claim. And what this is showing is the estimated ultimate cost per indemnity claim. Now, just to make sure we're all on the same page, an indemnity claim is one where you've lost time from work. There are really simple claims. You know, if you're, you're working on a pipe or something like that, and you slice your finger open and you need a couple of stitches, that could be what they call a medical-only claim. But these are claims where you've lost time. And if you can see on the left-hand side of the screen, in the early 2000s period, this is what led to that reform. Costs were going up quite substantially. And then the things that happened in that period, you can see a dip. The cost got, lower. And these are closed claims, so these are people who are getting back to work. And that's actually a good outcome, right? If it costs less to get people back to their job and back to work and back to physical functioning, that's what we're all looking for. The problem is if you take a look as the time progresses and we move to the right-hand side of the screen, actually costs are up beyond where they were at the beginning of the reform. So things have really not stuck.
So it seems that the reforms worked when they started, but they've decayed. Is that right? And why? Why aren't they sticking?
Well, a lot of complex things, but I mentioned earlier that this is intended to be a no-fault system, and so I asked you that question. Isn't it interesting that there's high litigation rates? And so I'm putting up here now what I call a litigation heat map, and you can see areas in the state that have a great deal, the red areas, of litigation. So in a system where, as your employer, I'm intended to just give you the benefits you're entitled to, but we're getting lawyers involved, and to some degree that's making the claims last quite a bit longer and have some of these other unintended consequences.
So is the solution to get rid of the lawyers? Is that what you're saying? Or is there another way to look at this?
Well, no. I think lawyers, I'm a lawyer myself, so I would hate to get rid of all the lawyers. And obviously, it's a complex system. So I understand completely that people may need to get an attorney, get a counselor, somebody to advise them. But when that happens, I think a thing to remember for any employer, really, is that the most important way to deal with an injured worker is fairly. And if you keep in touch with them and report claims quickly and take care of them, they may get an attorney, but it may not turn the claim into something much larger than it was intended to be. As you're doing that, I would say that if there is an attorney on the file, that probably means that you have counsel as well. So if the injured worker gets what they call an applicant attorney or plaintiff's attorney in the civil context, it's likely you'll have a defense attorney. And I always advise, get to know your lawyer. Don't treat them as if they're some outsider or some consultant, because if you have an open relationship and good communication, you're likely to get a better result. One tip that I would say for the water districts is look for an insurance company or a claims handling organization that has their own attorneys. And why do I say that? Well, as an attorney, you get paid when you bill. The attorneys that work in-house for insurance companies, whether that be my company or any other, and there are others that have it, they get paid a salary. So they're not always trying to keep the file open, maybe, and they're looking to try and get to a good resolution, and often they don't have to have a difficult relationship with the applicant attorney. So you'd like to find that situation where there's an alignment. The lawyer is there to help and resolve the claim as quickly as possible.
I understand that another way that the system works is through a concept called medical liens. What are those and how do they work?
Okay, so this is something that is sort of not well known, but it's important to understand. That one of the reforms I mentioned earlier has to do with the medical provider networks. And you want an insurance company that has, in my view at least, a tightly controlled medical network. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. But the idea is doctors who know how to treat workers' compensation injuries, and they're different than general healthcare injuries. So you find an insurance company that has put a lot of effort into getting good doctors, and sometimes, however, the injured worker will treat outside the network. They'll find a doctor that isn't part of the group that you've put together as a, sort of a panel of experts, and those doctors will treat and then file a lien. They don't get paid right away because they're not in the network, but they'll say, well, but I provided a service that was necessary, and the amount of liens is quite staggering. So going back in history, in 2010, there were more than $1 billion of medical liens filed. And the reason that I think it's important for people to understand this and maybe ask questions of their claims handling organization is, how does that get dealt with? So somebody says to you, Adon, or let's say MasterCard sends you a bill you know you don't owe, $200 for a restaurant you never went to. Do you just pay it? Well, of course you wouldn't do that. But sometimes that happens, and an insurance company might say, well, it's just a couple $100. I'll just pay it because I don't want to fight it. And that's not a good response, because that's medical money that's going into the experience of the employer, and that can increase their rates. So what you want to make sure is that with this little tricky topic of medical liens, is that your insurance company or claims handling organization, which could be a third-party administrator, has a tough stance on things and doesn't pay what they don't owe, the same you wouldn't pay a MasterCard for a dinner you never had.
Mm-hmm. So I get the part about litigation and getting to know your lawyer, and I think it sounds great. But are there other issues in the workers' compensation arena that are getting away from the original intent?
Yeah, there is another area, and I want to talk a little bit about this one. It's called cumulative trauma claims. So again, another technical term. Let me just explain that for a second. In really simple terms, if you are working for one of the water districts and you get on an emergency call and you slip and fall and you hurt your back, that's what they call a specific injury. But let's say that you have a job where there's a lot of lifting and you've been in that job for 25 years and you don't have a single thing that makes your shoulders hurt, but over that time your body is worn out. You know, maybe you've gotten a little tear here and there. That can be what they call a cumulative trauma or a cumulative injury. So as you can see on the screen, you see quite an interesting thing. We track it based on different regions of the state, and in the Bay Area and everywhere, basically everywhere outside of Los Angeles, the rate of cumulative trauma has been pretty steady over time. About 6 or 7% of claims that come in are these cumulative trauma claims. But what's interesting, and a real interesting phenomenon in the Los Angeles area, where, by the way, if we flip back to our litigation heat map, boy, there's a lot of litigation in Los Angeles. It's doubled in incidence. And the troubling thing about it is these claims last a long time, and they can often be hard to get at. You have to go to a lot of doctors. So it's not the same as you slipping and falling and hurting your back and you get an x-ray and you figure it out. It's, well, tell me about your job, and you might have to go to that qualified medical evaluator. And this is an area where these claims are legal, they're fine, but they become much more prevalent in certain areas.
Mm-hmm. There was a recent LA Times article about the changing dynamics of workers' compensation claims. Are all cumulative trauma claims basically the same, or how does that work?
Right, that's a good question. I saw that article. That was a really interesting dig into it. And no, they're not all the same. And I think that's important for customers and insureds to understand as well, because I think sometimes you work with somebody for a long time and they never told you they were hurt. And you think, well, maybe they're lying, maybe they're committing a fraud. But that's not always the case. So a few different types. There's what they call the post-termination claim. And that's a situation where, you know, you work for your employer 25, 30 years, and you leave your employment, and you have a period of time to make a claim. And you don't make a claim right when you leave, and you never said anything about it, but you make it later. And that's one flavor of it. A different one is long-term employee. You know, you've told your supervisor, you know, boss, my shoulder's hurting, and no, I didn't fall or anything like that, but you know, the boss knows you've been doing that lifting, you've been whatever it is, a physical job. That's another type of claim, and you think in your mind, yeah, I mean, that could be, you know, that could be legitimate, and I can understand that. And then a further type is a very short-term employee. So by its nature, you think of the term cumulative trauma. Well, is it really the case that if I work for you for 2 months, I can have a cumulative trauma? And often those go with post-termination. So you may have a difficult relationship with your boss, you get fired, and you go, you know what, I'm going to make a cumulative trauma claim. And even after only a short period of time. And then again, that leads to a lot of back and forth and a lot of cost to try and figure out, well, is it really possible that that happened?
So while there's different situations to address, do you handle them all the same way?
Well, that's a good point. So no, the kinds of claims really make a difference in how you address them. Sometimes we find that a terminated employee is angry, right? They may go and they may get a lawyer, a friend of theirs will say, you know, you didn't get treated fairly, and they'll make a workers' compensation claim. But a lot of times they won't pursue it. They'll get another job. Maybe they weren't really injured, maybe, you know, they got better or what have you. So there's a situation where I would say, you know, just wait and see. It's the injured worker's right to make the claim. Never say it isn't their right to make the claim, but they also have to pursue the claim. And sometimes we find that they just want to move on with their life. And if they don't pursue it, we'll go to the court and say, hey, Adon doesn't want to pursue this claim, and go ahead and turn it off, essentially. Another one is a situation where we just don't believe it. You're a 24-year-old, you stole from the cash register, you get terminated, and all of a sudden you have a lawyer who claims that you have a cumulative trauma even though you only worked there a month. Come on, really? I mean, I suppose it's possible and it's your right to try and prove it, but in that case you want an insurance company or claims handler of some sort who's willing to stand up for your rights and say, you know, no, you might win, but you're going to have to convince a judge. So we would say we would deny that claim and then take it to trial. You have to be willing to do that sometimes. Other times, a settlement is the right answer. I know sometimes employers think, oh, geez, you know, you're just giving away the money, and that's not the case. I mean, if we get that 30-year employee who, you know, did complain sometimes, was a good worker, you know, they're entitled to a cumulative trauma claim if it's legitimate. And why go through all of the hassle? Why not just go to the person and say, you know, Susie, I know you have this claim. It's totally your right to bring it. I understand how you might have some permanent disability. What if I were to offer you this amount of money early? Talk to their lawyer if they have an attorney and just resolve it. And I would say strategic thinking is important here. What kind of claim is it? And make sure that as a consumer of workers' compensation, you're finding you can have this kind of conversation that we're having with your insurance company. A final issue, you know, sometimes people really want to deny the claim, you know, be strong. But that medical provider network that I mentioned to you earlier it has good doctors in it, hopefully. And if you deny the claim, then the injured worker treats outside your network. If you think, you know what, legitimate claim like the Susie one we talked about, maybe you want to accept that claim, talk about settlement, but have them treat with the expert workers' compensation doctors. So very important that you find somebody who can provide workers' compensation in a quality way and have this kind of nuanced dialogue.
Okay. So workers' compensation was supposed to be simple, and it's really complicated. Is there a more holistic way of dealing with these challenges than through liens, litigation, and cumulative trauma?
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of what we've been talking about, and what I mentioned at the very beginning is you want to find somebody who can help you get back to that 30,000-foot view of what is workers' compensation supposed to be. It's supposed to be, in its purest sense, a benefit delivery system. And a secret sauce, I guess I would say, that you can look to is, does your insurance company or claims handler have integrated services? And what do I mean by that? Well, we've already talked about some of these issues, but there's often litigation. So is there legal expertise? Do they have their own in-house attorneys? There are medical issues, not necessarily the hands-on treatment by the doctor, but the doctor will submit a report. It's very helpful to have nursing on staff, to have nurses in your operation where they're not you know, somewhere on a call center somewhere. In our case, we have 5 board-certified doctors on our staff. Now, they're not rendering the care, but I'm not a doctor. I don't think you're a doctor. There are things that are in medical reports that I don't understand, but I'm blessed because I've got an orthopedic surgeon on staff that I can go and say, hey, Dr. Smith, I don't understand what this means. Is this a serious injury? Is this not? Is it going to need surgery? And better informed claims handling makes for a better outcome. Pharmacy, I think we've all heard about this opioid epidemic that's going on, and it's truly a tragedy. We have an in-house pharmacist. And that person is able to look at drug interactions and make sure that if you're getting one kind of medication, it's not accidentally going to have a bad reaction with another kind of medication. Also, if you've been prescribed opioids for too long a period of time, then the pharmacist can get on the phone with the doctor and say, hey, doc, maybe we should be thinking about Adon, isn't benefiting from this, and we should try another pathway. Another interesting one, and particularly in California, is translation services. So in our business, we insure many agricultural accounts. And there are a lot of workers who are monolingual Spanish speaking. And many companies will use outside translators, but we have ours in-house. And that's very helpful because they know the language, they know the lingo, they're immediately available, and they're learning over time. It's another one of those maybe secret sauce kind of things that I think people should look at. Another one, and it's up there on the screen, is field adjusters. So I like to say that sometimes the old way of doing business is the best way of doing business. Face to face, shake your hand. If I owe you money, let me bring you the check. So we have, a number of years ago, we hired a whole staff of field adjusters, and they're bilingual, Spanish and English. They will go and talk to the injured worker and maybe convey that feeling of, we really want you back at work, we want the right thing for you, and avoid some of the confusion that can happen in a fairly complex system.
Okay. Seems like you're suggesting an integrated approach, but isn't such an approach expensive? And what about smaller and larger systems?
Well, so I have this funny little iceberg image here, and it comes from a situation where we had, as Zenith Insurance, the chance to take over a group of claims from a related company. Mm-hmm. And they had been approaching it with a non-integrated kind of a methodology. And the reason they did that was because the out-the-door price was different than the price they were quoted. So what do I mean by that? They were paying an administrator, other than us, a certain amount of money, but they were getting nickel and dimed, except in this case the nickels and dimes were adding up to millions of dollars. And by not having an integrated approach, and this was the really important piece, the outcome for the injured workers wasn't as good. So they were paying more and more money for these claims. And they came to us and we quoted them a single price, and we said, this is what it's going to cost you for all of those things I mentioned, the nurses, the lawyers, the doctors. And they were able to pay less up front and also get a better outcome. As to your question about larger and smaller water districts, that's it. So I think both can benefit from this integrated approach, and in two ways. With a larger district, if you have 50, 100, 200 employees, you're probably going to have claims experience. These people are doing physical labor often, and you're going to have a number of injuries. Well, then it's really important to control those costs. You might be able to take advantage of what we call loss control and get safety engineers in your operation early before injuries even happen and fix things. When the injuries do happen, you want to run your business, right? You want to run a water district. You want to get to work and deal with your employees. You don't want to have to be calling up lawyers and nurses. You want somebody who will do that for you, I would think. Even if you have a human resources manager or somebody who takes care of that, they have other jobs. In a smaller water district, maybe even more so, because hopefully you won't have too many claims. You might not need loss control. Maybe you've got 3, 4, 5 employees and you know each other. But you want the best of care. I mean, in fact, they may be your relatives sometimes. You've hired your cousin or your nephew, and if they get injured, you want to make sure that they're getting the absolute best care. So you want that in the hands of somebody who, if necessary, they've got a field adjuster. They'll go talk to your nephew or your cousin. They'll have a nurse who can get them on the phone and say, I know you're confused about this. And I think that's a much better way. And if we avoid miscommunication, then we get to a better outcome more quickly.
Okay, you've told us how important medical networks and doctors are. Can you tell us a little bit more about this?
Yeah, and this goes to a fully realized integrated system. So the chart I'm showing here talks about medical cost containment. And of course, we all, when we buy something, we want to get a good value. And as I think we all know, good value isn't necessarily the cheapest price. And all companies have some element of dealing with medical costs. And these are the bills that come in from doctors, the translation services, the physical therapy, and so forth. And I would say on the left of this chart, as I'm looking at it, what I would call basic foundational savings. So you have an insurance company or a claims handler, and they apply state fee schedules. So what does this mean? If you go to a doctor, the state, the Division of Workers' Compensation, actually says a doctor's visit is worth this amount of money. Everybody does that. So if you're interviewing for a new insurance company, they're all going to say that. Then you might want to be a smarter consumer and say, well, that's fine, everybody does that. What kind of edits do you have in your bill review system? Do you look for potential overcharges or undercharges? Sometimes we see that as well. What kind of contracts do you have with hospitals? We obviously want centers of excellence. If somebody has, God forbid, a serious burn injury, we want them going to the best location. But the best location doesn't cost the same for everybody. I think we all know that there's an ability to negotiate, and you want to see that happen. There's this thing called ancillary networks. And what is ancillary? Well, a wheelchair, what we call durable medical equipment. If you need crutches, or if you're going to be released to home but you need a hospital bed, one that can tilt you up and so forth. All of those can be acquired and are part of the benefits that people are entitled to in workers' compensation. But you want a company that's got a good partnership and a good contract rate with the company that's supplying these durable medical equipment pieces. Because why? Because that goes into your experience mod, and it eventually will determine how much you pay for your workers' compensation insurance. Another step in the pathway, number 5 here on my list, is pharmacy benefit management. So for us, about 25% to 28% of all of our medical costs are medicine. So pills and injections and so forth. And like everything else, you can find better pricing. We're never going to compromise on quality. We don't get cut rate, non-effective medicines, but you want somebody who has not only a pharmacy benefit manager, but ideally a network, because like doctor networks, there are better pharmacies than others. And a key question that I would suggest for the water districts, anybody who's making a buying decision, is ask your carrier, do they have a pharmacy benefit network, not just a pharmacy benefit manager? Then you want to have negotiations. So in our area, we have nurses who actually look at the medical necessity of bills. This might have been something you've seen in the news as well. Sometimes medical providers bill for things that weren't appropriate, that didn't necessarily even happen. And there have been cases recently where a number of doctors have been arrested for doing or billing for surgeries that never occurred. And if you've got nurses on staff, they can look at the medical reports and say, no, that doesn't sound right to me, and you can go back to the hospital, and often they won't necessarily say, yes, you're right, you caught us, but they'll say, oh, we'll take a lower price. And I'm proud to say that our people deal with these things as if it was their own money. Again, back to that MasterCard example, not paying for something that you didn't actually use. And then the final step is that really customized network. Finding the doctors who want to be in occupational medicine, who want to treat workers' compensation. And sometimes people will rank their network based on how many doctors. They'll say, well, 89% of all of my medical care happened in the network. Well, the easiest way to do that is to just welcome everybody in. But not everybody is equally capable of treating a workers' compensation injury, so you're actually better having a customized, fairly narrow network with all the specialties you need in it, but with people who are true experts.
Okay. This is great information. I've learned a lot. How would you wrap this up for our viewers?
Well, I'd just like to circle back to what I said at the beginning. First of all, I really appreciate you and the organization having me in to talk about this. I think if people appreciate the benefit of these aligned services and having even a short discussion with somebody who's going to provide something that is compulsory, legally required, but not a commodity, you can get so much of a better outcome, not only for yourself, not only in the ultimate cost, but at the end of the day, what it all matters for is the injured worker who can get these services, get better, and get back to productive employment.
So it sounds like the goal is simple, as complicated as it is, and thank you for being here to explain all that to us today.
Thank you again.
Thank you. This topic is important not only to our viewers in the water industry, but to policy officials and public officials that care about the health of water systems and small systems and their employees. Getting workers' compensation insurance in California through pooled sources like CalMutuals is a way to help is a way for larger systems to help smaller systems. And the insurance itself is key for things like state grants that are currently a priority for the state in helping small systems. We hope that this module brought to you by AAWDM helps you understand workers' compensation insurance better so that you can make informed choices when you're in the market searching for a policy. Thank you.